Basu and Godin notebook. 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 Basu and Godin notebook.
All right, Arpin. So despite my diagnosed pneumonia, we're doing this podcast today. I'll let you go at length today, and I'll interject at some point.
So unlike me. So unlike me to go on and on. Yeah, exactly.
I know.
I'm gonna have to get out of character here.
I know listeners will be completely baffled and out of their element too. Okay, no, kidding aside. So welcome everybody to the Basu and Godin Notebook on this Monday, April 29th. So Arpin, today we thought of doing something a little bit different. There was an episode not too long ago where we took inspiration from the Vancouver Canucks, their path to respectability this year, how the Canadians wanted to basically do the same next season. But let's do something else today and look at another Canadian team, which now is on the brink of the precipice yet again, the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I think it's worth looking at their situation because on the one hand, it could be that you look at the way that they've done things over the past few years, and their rebuild has hit many of the right notes. And I think that a lot of the Montreal Canadiens fans would have liked to see the Montreal Canadiens go about the same way and tanking for real, getting like the superstar at number one, hitting on all their high draft picks and whatnot. And yet, despite 7 or 8 years of that regimen, they seem to be at the crossroads, and their formula has not worked. So I would, how about we dissect a little bit of how they did things and how we can compare that to how the Canadians are doing their own rebuild, and if there are some lessons that they can learn from them.
Well, yeah, I think one thing to me that strikes me about the Maple Leafs that is very different from what the Canadians are doing. In fact, they're kind of doing the opposite. Is year after year, everyone looks at this Maple Leafs team, and what do they say that they need? They need defense. And it comes up this time of year every time. Listen, they don't have 6 defensemen they can put in the lineup that they can count on. The other night they put TJ Brody in, not great, and has had, and it was predictable.
He used to be good.
He used to be good, but he's had a difficult season. Mark Giordano is getting up in years. Who knows if we'll see him in the next game, but it's Timothy Liljegren, who they used a first round pick on, is not reliable. I mean, it's just, it seems that doubling down on their strength costs them every year. Now, why I find this interesting, it's actually, to me, it's 2 Canadian teams, because you look at the game that Edmonton won in Los Angeles last night, and 0-0 5-on-5 game, they scored a power play goal, and that's the difference. And that's not a game that Edmonton, you would think, could have won in previous years. To me, what's made the biggest difference for Edmonton was when they got Matthias Ekholm. And having him paired with Evan Bouchard kind of unlocked Evan Bouchard he was already a very good player, obviously, but I think he's hit another level with Ekholm next to him. And it kind of allowed their entire defense core to kind of fall into place. And listen, it's not a perfect defense core in Edmonton by any stretch, but just adding that one sturdy, big, physical defenseman who can move the puck and has some skill and complements Evan Bouchard really well, I think made a real big difference for Edmonton and allowed them to win more playoff style hockey games. Toronto has Morgan Rielly, who's an excellent defenseman, but not an upper tier. He's not going to probably not going to win a Norris Trophy in his lifetime. You know, I mean, it's just he's a very, very, very good defenseman. And then it kind of gets mushy. You know, it's just sort of these moving parts in and out. And so what I find interesting and what we've talked about already and looked at is the Canadians' decision to go sort of heavy on defense at
Yeah.
first. You know, the way they've gone about it since Gorton and Hughes came in. You know, they inherited Logan Mailloux obviously, but they decided to sign him and they gave him his NHL debut. They've endorsed him as a prospect. Obviously the David Reinbacher pick and Lane Hudson coming in. I mean, these are, you know, so many of the prime young players in the organization right now are defensemen. Obviously, they acquired Justin Barron as well, and so
But
it's
many were picks from the Bergevin Timmins era, though. Not only Mailloux,
absolutely
but the previous administration signed Jacky. They drafted Harris. They drafted Struble. So they drafted Gooley. So it's
so.
really
Given that,
a process that has started already.
right? But they doubled down on it, right? I mean, the Reinbacher pick was with that all in place.
Yeah.
All those guys were there, and they're all, you know, good pieces. Like if you had, you know, if you had a defense that had like Gooley, Mailloux, you know, you take Hudson and Reinbacher out of the mix, basically. You still have Gooley, Mailloux, Struble, Harris, Jacky, as you mentioned. A good young nucleus along with the holdovers from that organization. So this was a decision that this group made that no, we need to shore this up first.
Yeah.
And there's some merit to it, you know. I mean, I think the Leafs are an extreme example of it, and because you look at the Bruins, and you know their defense is better than the Leafs' defense. It's not a world class, world beater defense, but still, when you're building around a Charlie McAvoy, and they just have solid defensemen up and down the lineup, you know, and even like a guy like Lorai who had some sort of ups and downs this season, but has played pretty well, I think, in the playoffs so far, and you know,
good.
for a depth defenseman is pretty good. So yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind how hockey's played now, because this administration has always said, from the scouting staff to the management, that we look at playoff hockey and evaluating our players. We're trying to find players who will excel in playoff style hockey. The Uri Slavkovsky pick was based on that. The Reinbacher pick was based on that. That's what they always say at the draft, is we are looking at playoff hockey and players who will excel in that phase of the game. And I got to be honest, Reinbacher remains to be seen, but from what I've seen from him, he seems to be a guy like that. Like he is, you know, his strengths are not spectacular. I recently did a piece on him and included some video from his games in Laval, and they were all kind of based on, you know, his gap control and his, you know, killing plays and his first pass, things like that. They're very fundamental, basic things. And you know, you get some comments like, you know, these are like, what are these are not highlight plays, you know, like what, like anyone could do these things. And the fact is that they can't. Not everyone can do these things. And the fact that they have a guy who at 19 was able to come into pro hockey in North America, already having played pro hockey in Switzerland, and having these components, these aspects of his game really refined at such a young age, lends you to believe that he could, you know, those are the types of things that are important in the playoffs. Denying rush opportunities, denying zone entries, you know, sort of snuffing out plays in the defensive zone as quickly as you can. And these are things that, frankly, you watch the Leafs, they have trouble with. You know, it's really, I don't, you know, I think there's always going to be increased value on the superstar offensive player. And, you know, I think a few years from now, Chicago is going to be just feeling blessed that they have Connor Bedard. They will have built an entire franchise around this one guy. And it's true that you can do that. And the Leafs have that and the Oilers have that. But again, I go back to the Oilers. To me, what unlocked their full potential as a team was the addition of Ekholm, and the Leafs need a guy like that. They just do. It's just, and it's evident year after year, spring after spring after spring, that they need one, if not two, if not three guys who can come in and stabilize their defense. Like, you look at the types of guys they tried to get at the deadline this year, Lyubushkin and
And
Edmondson,
Edmondson, yeah,
and Edmondson's one of their most important defensemen right now, and that's not ideal. As good as he is in the playoffs, he's playing too much for them. But they
yeah.
have no choice; they have to.
Well, they decided to go for. They decided to add more third pairing defensemen. They added two guys instead of getting one guy that probably could have cost them a bit more in terms of assets, but would have made the sort of impact that Ekholm has been having in Edmonton. I don't know if
Oh, I
that
mean, Tanev.
defenseman was there to be had, but Tanev's a good example. I mean, you see the impact that Hannafin has also on the Golden Knights blue line.
Hmm.
That's significant. So yeah, I think that the blue line's a good starting point to make our little exercise there because uh, down the road, I mean, this far from a finished product from Montreal, and you could argue that some of those defensemen, you know, especially Hudson, I would say Hudson, Mayu, and Matheson, if he's still around, it's those guys are heavily offensively inclined, but you've
Hmm.
got to have that balance too. Other guys that will be more responsible. You mentioned Reinbacher. I think that Struble has a surprisingly balanced game also that really has expanded since he joined the pros. Gooley, very balanced player too. Jack I think that he'll come into his own and mature as a player defensively too. So this is an interesting basis because earlier in the season, when we touched on that subject, we mentioned how rare it is that teams actually rebuild through their defense. And the
Hmm.
only good example that we came up was the Anaheim Ducks around 2010-11, back in the day when they drafted Cam Fowler, Shea Theodore, Hampus Lindholm, Brendan
Hmm.
Montour, Marcus Peterson. That's a lot. That's a lot of guys, you know. And eventually, I mean, they don't have a Stanley Cup championship to show for it, but that was, I mean, they were quite good for a few years there.
Hmm.
So I think it's an interesting choice from the Canadians, but I wonder if this will allow them, at least in terms of money allocation, um, to go after to make sure that they've got enough firepower up front and they have enough money, enough resources to do so. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that.
Well, I mean, it's in terms of money allocation. Yeah. Well, these guys are going to have to get signed to contracts relatively soon, and yes, that can get costly. I think another team that kind of was built around their defense, to some extent, was say the St. Louis Cup team. Um,
Yeah,
Petrangelo, Parayko. Obviously, Edmondson was a younger player then. They had some solid. They had a solid blue line, and to me, like when I look at, you look at obviously the Golden Knights last year, and then they add to that blue line with Hannafin this year. Um, when you can enter a season with like seven quality prime age defensemen, that frees you up at the trade deadline to address if you need to add pieces at the deadline. You don't have to add those. Like, that takes care of that, and you can focus on bringing in some scoring and doing it that way, which kind of like what the Jets did this year, right? Then they added Monahan and Toffoli, and they tried to shore up their attack. Um, finding a goalie and finding like a prime top four defenseman at the deadline is generally difficult because the guys who are available, well, not the goalies, but for defensemen, the guys who are available, there are a lot of teams in on them. And
yeah,
you look at Tanev, and obviously the market got all screwy this year, but he fetched essentially 2 second round picks, right? The defenseman that went from the Stars to the Flames, Artem Grushnikov, was a second round pick, and they got another second round pick out of it. But honestly, if Toronto Toronto were willing to throw in a first and a decent prospect like Rushnikov is hardly an A prospect. He's a good player. They could have had him probably.
Yeah.
You would think. And so um, it's a matter of decisions. Like they decide to go with because actually, and I don't think this is crazy. They might have just been like, okay, well, if we put all our chips into getting Tanev, we can't get anyone else. And we need more than one defenseman to make this defense work. And so like they decided to get two instead of one. So,
Hmm.
but I think the way the Canadians have gone, um, we haven't even talked about Adam Engstrom coming down the pipe. God, what's the Russian kid's name? Konyushkov.
Konyushkov, yeah, Bogdan
Yes, that's right.
Konyushkov, yeah.
So he's probably about how many years left on his contract? 2 years, I think, after this one. So
Yes.
yeah, so he'll be eventually a possibility or an option. And so if you have constantly it seems to me that defense is in the playoffs is the most important position. Like it becomes clear year after year. And yes, you need scoring. Yes, you need everything. But if
Hmm.
you have a solid defense that it's not a question and that you don't have to bring you guys in and out of the lineup and you know that every night you're going with these six guys or you can rotate in a guy if you have seven capable guys, that's a good strength to have in playoff hockey, I feel. And I think like every year we kind of see that. Like look at like honestly, I don't think like Washington wasn't a good team. It was probably the worst playoff team. But I would like to see them play that series with Sandin and Jensen like healthy. Like two of their six defensemen are out, and it makes a world of difference. And really they played that. It was a sweep, but they were in that series. They were in every game almost, and I think 5-on-5. I think it was 7-5 for the Rangers in that series. It was really one on special teams, but you take out two defensemen, and it's tough in the playoffs, man. Like it's really, and so yeah. I mean, that's one area for Toronto where you're like, this is something that's been known about your group for years.
Yeah.
That you need to address this position, and
That and goalie. It's been
yeah,
uncertain in net, and I think that the Canadians are in a good situation now, having Fowler in the pipeline, and we'll see what happened to with Dobesh too, if he amounts to anything. But for the time being, I think that their
Volokin.
situation, Volokin too, yeah. But the
Yeah.
situation in net shows how they consider themselves to be really in a transition period. So one day it might just be that when they're better and they've got maybe that they're bountiful on defense, or they have enough assets, it won't be a forward that they'll go after. It might be a goalie. Who knows if that's the one prime piece that they miss it in the puzzle. But that's, you got to make sure that, because that's one thing that we see year after year in the playoffs, is that you don't necessarily win with the best goalie, but if you don't
Mhm.
have a good enough goalie, you're going to lose. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And year
Yeah.
after year, to come back with the Maple Leafs, they hit into teams that have a better goalie than what they have between the pipes. So,
Mhm. Yeah. That
um,
was I think that was a good. I think you're going to mention a piece from Sean McIndoe, and he had a piece after Game 4, but it was something to the effect of he had a line where maybe entering the series with the third best goalie isn't the best thing, or something to that effect. And it's kind of
right,
like, yeah,
exactly.
which I thought was very clever. But yeah, it's just reality, and and sometimes it just shows the extent to which goaltending is so hard to predict. You remember a couple of years ago when the Flames were looking really good, and then Markstrom just fell apart in the playoffs all of a sudden. Like, you can't
Against
plan for that
Edmonton, yeah,
against Edmonton. You cannot plan for that. And Samsonov, frankly, from the time that he was sent down and given a week to kind of reset, and he came back, and it was such a great story. Like, I mean, he was playing really well. It would have been hard at the trade deadline for the Leafs to look at Samsonov and be like, I mean, it wouldn't be hard to say we need some insurance for this guy, like, because who knows?
Mhm.
He could. We've seen the worst that it can get with him, but it was hard to look at him and be like, wow, we have this is a problem. Like he was playing really well for them, and so that's the thing. That's the difficulty with goaltending is just that you just never know. You never know when your guy's basically going to get the yips, right? And like Markstrom was a Vezina caliber goalie that year. I think he was actually a finalist for the Vezina, if I'm not mistaken, and just crumbled. So it's
Took
it's
him three
hard to
years
know.
to recover.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah, yeah. So Sean McIndoe, your colleague at the Athletic, had a good overview of how the Toronto Maple Leafs went about uh, rebuilding themselves, and I think
Mhm,
that it can be used as a comparison tool with the Canadians. He said they committed to a rebuild. They openly tanked when it made sense. They got lucky in the lottery. They hit home runs on all their high picks. They lured the big name free agent. They had the veterans lining up to take hometown discounts. They hired the smart young GM and eventually found the up and coming coach. They've done a great job of finding cheap depth. They've spent the last few years trading away draft picks for the final pieces of the puzzle.
mhm,
And all the while, I should add, while being ahead of the curve when it came to analytics, player development, and skill coaches. So I read that and I'm thinking this is the way it should go, and yet
mhm.
it
This
didn't
is the way.
work.
Yeah.
This is not the way. And one of the aspects there, um, they lured the big name free agent. I think that a lot. I don't know to which extent it's got to do with the fact that we lived under a flat cap for these last few years, but it seems that the Tavares contract, however productive Tavares was during the regular season for years since he joined the Leafs, has been a bit of a hindrance uh, to invest in other position, namely for on defense.
Mhm,
But when we the other day, I was saying how I felt as though this summer will be the summer of the big trade for the Canadians, and the summer of 2025 would be the the summer of the big name free agent. Um, but I wonder, I mean, if the Canadians do add a top six forward and they manage to draft also in the process either a Lindstrom, a Demidov, an Iginla, or Berkeley Catton, or whatever, a guy that
mhm,
has the talent to be a top six forward, would it be a mistake to go after yet one more big time free agent? Because in 2025 there's going to be superstars like Draisaitl, Rantanen, Marner, Hedman, Marchand.
mhm.
Those guys are not sure to hit the market, but for now they're on that trajectory of hitting free agency in 2025. And there's also all these other names like Brock Besser and Nick Ehlers, Sharangovich in Calgary, Carter Verhage, Yanni Gourde, Buchnevich in St. Louis. So a lot of quality players potentially to be had on the free agent market. But if we look at the template of the Toronto Maple Leafs, is there a chance with the young group of forwards that the Canadians have, if you add to that a top six forward acquired by trade and
Mhm.
another one that you would draft this summer, would it be a mistake all of a sudden to try to overdo it by adding one more big guy that could put your salary structure in shambles and take away the possibility or the flexibility of adding either at significant other positions or skills, let's say, like in terms of intimidation, in terms of experience, or just simply a veteran blue liner or veteran goalie, as I was referring to before. But is there a risk that trying to go for a star free agent could lead to the same dead end that Tavares ended up, doing for Toronto?
Uh, I don't know. I mean, listen, I think Tavares, the moment he signed that contract, I think most people felt that that's great and he's really good and a lot of teams would love to have him, but didn't strike me at the time as being something that the Leafs really needed. Um, for the Canadians, but that's because they had Matthews, Nylander, and Marner, and you could go add some maybe second tier forwards or just create just more depth around those guys and build a pretty good forward group, right? Now,
Yeah.
obviously, Tavares made it formidable and made it so that that was going to be the team's strength. But so I think yes, there's some risk to adding a free agent, but it's got to be kind of a smart ad, you know. And like right now, if you look at the Canadians, you know, and you were right to say 25 is more likely time to strike for free agency. Not only is the market seemingly more interesting at this point, but you know, the Dvorak contract is off the books, the Armia contract is off the books, potentially the Evans contract is off the books. I mean, if you just add those three guys together, you're looking at roughly almost $10 million, like more than $9 million. That's freed up. So
Plus Savard too.
plus Saval, exactly
Mm.
right. Um, so that makes a lot of sense. And at that point, they will have a better idea of where everyone is slotted in. They will have had presumably a season of a healthy Kirby Doc. They'll know if Alex Newhook is a third line center or a top line wing. Even though I think they're probably leaning top six winger more than third line center, but you never know.
Yeah.
They'll just have a lot more answers. They'll know if Josh Anderson's horrible season was a one off, and if he can build himself back up to what he was previously, which is still an imperfect player, but a pretty effective player for what he does. And definitely, you know, if you're looking at playoff hockey, a guy who is very effective in a playoff series when, you know, when he can really lay physical damage. They'll know if Brendan Gallagher's end of his season was a sign that maybe he could get into like 20 goal range as a depth piece. They'll have a lot more answers to work with, and they'll have a lot more um, information to go on as to what's the right free agent piece to add. But you know, I look at this season. Sometimes opportunity is there, and you just have to take it, right? And like, which is what happened with Panarin in New York. Obviously, not to keep harping on the New York thing, but it's a fact that Jeff Gordon was there, and it probably wasn't the right time in in the rebuild of the Rangers to sign a big name free agent. But sometimes you can't pick the right time, and that was that instance where you have this world class player, one of the top wingers in the league, who is wants to come play for your team, just wants a fair market value contract, which he got, and has been amazing for them. And so that's the other side of it, you know. Like it's yes, Tavares is sort of not even I wouldn't even say the bad side because he gave them many good productive years where he made the
For
Leafs look
sure.
very complicated to defend. Just is kind of predictably winding down at this stage of his contract, which I think everyone kind of saw that the last couple of years of that contract are probably going to be pretty tough. So this year, you know, if one of Jake Gensel or Sam Reinhart were to become available, like those are guys that seem like a really good fit for what the Canadians need. Like they need a scoring winger, and
Yeah.
that's what those two guys are. I don't know the extent. Like Reinhardt doesn't sound like it's likely at all, um, which is what makes Verhaeghe next year perhaps intriguing, or Montour this year. But I don't know. I don't think that's a fit for the Canadians. But you know, he might be the one that shakes free there. Something's going to have to shake free in Florida. I don't think it's going to be Reinhardt, but we'll see. And then Gensel, obviously, we'll see what happens once Carolina's done with this run. But if one of them were available, sometimes you just got to be like, okay, well, that's a pretty good fit for what we need. Um, we should just go get that guy now. And I think Gordon's past suggests that he doesn't care what stage of the rebuild they're at. If there's an opportunity available, then you go for that opportunity and try and make it work after the fact.
Yeah. But when Panarin signed with the Rangers though, I
Hmm.
mean Zibanejad was in his mid 20s. Kreider
Yeah.
was in his mid to late 20s. Truba, mid 20s. Um, you had already some pieces there that were not just up and coming players. There were guys that were already somewhat established, you know? So I
Hmm.
think when you talk about bringing a UFA this summer, it's also each year because the example of Tavares is relevant. Each year is important in how much you invest into that UFA player in comparison to the trajectory of the rest of your team. So if your team is not quite ready to win because their nucleus is too young and you bring in a guy who's 21 or 30 years old, each of those years, prior or after 30 is impactful. So um, I think that the sense uh, that Jeff Gorton had is that maybe that they had Panarin, they signed Panarin a bit earlier than they thought they could, but the opportunity presented itself. I'm not sure if, let's say, you mentioned Gensel, if Gensel was a possibility, I'm not sure that it was like, oh, we have this one chance in a lifetime because of all the guys that will be available the year after. When the next season starts, he'll turn 30 already. To
Hmm.
me, if you don't have a group that's ready to compete, uh, it's risky to sign a guy who's going to start his contract at 30 years old. He's great. There's no doubt that the Canadians would need a player like that. But it's just how can you make things coincide so that you can have a maximum of good years from that UFA and that the team has a legitimate chance to win before that UFA starts declining. And that window, there needs to be like a crossover between the nucleus getting ripe and the UFA not starting his descent right away. So
Hmm.
that's another reason for me that leads me to think that they're better off waiting another year.
Yeah, perhaps, but I mean, other than being a year older, how is the nucleus going to change that much between this? That's my point. Is that it's
No, no, it's not that they're
if
going to change. They're not going to change. It's just a matter of mileage, experience, and getting better. You see how 1 year made Suzuki better. How 1 year made how 4 months made Slav better. So you give them one more year and then you add a significant piece. That's interesting, and that's again is it all depends what happens this summer. But I'm just for the sake of debate, I'm just wondering if a year from now it's even going to be considered the best way to spend your money. But
I
it's
just
attractive. It's just that when you look, there's, I mean, it's not as though the Canadians are a team that's so loaded with offense that they don't know what to do with it anymore. For
yeah.
sure, they would have everything would need to hit, the right note and all their guys reaching their peak potential in order for them to be a very very good team. So yeah, maybe that no matter what that they're going to look at adding, but it's just that the type of player that they would be in a position to add, uh, and the money that they'll need to dedicate from it will also be dependent on the progress that they made over the course of next year.
But yeah, but to me, the Tavares comparable here would be the Canadians going after Montour.
Okay.
Like that's a player that you're adding a player in a position at a position where you don't really need the help and you don't need to allocate that much money to. Because you're already allocating, well, at least in the Leafs case, they knew they would be allocating significant amounts of dollars to Matthews and Marner. Um, Eventually, they couldn't have foreseen how the Nylander thing was going to shake out, but obviously he's also commanded a big salary, and so it's that's what makes Tavares kind of not redundant, but makes him a cap strain is that they've had So if you go out and get him on tour and say, hey, he's a right shot D, he can maybe help transition to when our young right shot D will be ready, and he'll make our team better, and we can compete on a nightly basis. But you got to pay him $9 million a year or whatever it's going to cost to sign him. It would be somewhat short-sighted. And I think Ken Hughes talked about it, like, short term versus long term. Are we going to bring in a guy who's going to block a
Yeah.
right? You literally use this example as something not to do when looking in the long term, and that's, to me, that's him saying, I'm not going to do something like what they did with Tavares. But if you were to get um, a bona fide, proven goal scoring winger that will help this team now and when it's good, and it won't necessarily block anyone from anything, I think they'll look at it. And that's what I think guys like Reinhardt and Gensel represent. Like, who exactly in the organization would they be blocking?
Nobody.
It's
Yeah.
not a whole lot. I mean,
No.
like Meshar, maybe, like if he's playing on the wing, like
Yeah.
so it's this year, next year, whatever. Like, sometimes if they decide that that's the kind of guy, like if they look at Sam Reinhart, if somehow Sam Reinhart, and let's be clear, he's likely signing with the Florida Panthers. Somehow, if he were to become free agent, red flag number one is that this is his big breakout year, right? Like the year he hits for you unrestricted free agents, but he's been good for a while for Florida, but just not to this level. But you look at him and you see a guy who scored an insane amount of goals from the bumper on the power play. A right shot on the bumper on the power play, and you're like, we could use a guy like that. Like, that guy would fit on our power play really well. He could score those goals for our power play, and he could create either a secondary line with Doc and someone else, or allow Slav to go with Doc and he could play with Suzuki and Caulfield or whatever you. He just there's different avenues that he could fit, but where I think your point is important is that the Canadians have to be sure that that guy is the right guy, and that he's not going to be an anchor, and he's not going to be, because they're still not out of the woods cap wise. Like, it's until that Carey Price contract is either expired or they manage to trade it. And as long as Josh Anderson and Brendan Gallagher take up $12 million of their salary cap, assuming they don't perform up to that level, they're going to have to be tight with money for sure.
Yeah.
They have to be very judicious with what they do money wise, but it is starting to clear up a little bit for them, but they're not quite at the stage where they can just, take big home run swings on the free agent market and strike out. I don't think they're really at that stage yet.
Okay, speaking of money, I wanted to bring you somewhere else, and it's regarding the team culture and the willingness to take a hometown discount. McIndoe said, Toronto brought in veterans at a discount. Yeah, for sure. Spezza, Thornton, guys that were at the tail end of their career signed for pretty much league minimum or a little over the league minimum. But you look at their stars, they played hardball in negotiations. Austin Matthews structured, or put in fashion the new long-term but not so long-term deal that
the medium-term deal.
Yeah, that enables you to really maximize your earnings over the course of your career. And he never got, it seems like he got it for both contracts exactly what he wanted, and the Leafs just paid a premium on him. Then they paid a premium on Marner. They didn't exactly get a hometown discount when they signed Tavares either back in the day. And then Nylander came there and he said, listen, the other guys didn't take a discount. Why should I? So all of a sudden you have your core pieces that did not take a hometown discount, and they looked at what could favor their individual situation. Now I look in Montreal, everything, the structure, salary structure, at least up front, seems to be, for the time being, based around Nick Suzuki. So, the price for Caulfield, his salary was measured in comparison to Suzuki, we discussed the other day how Slavkovsky maybe he might get a different percentage of the cap for his next contract, but it shouldn't be outrageously more than Suzuki. So,
Mhm.
do you think that there is a chance there with this team growing together and learning how to win together that there might not be a sense, and that's why I'm bringing it to culture, where those guys are not necessarily going to look first and foremost to what's good for them individually and make
Mhm.
sure that this team flourishes with enough money to spend to make sure that you have enough good pieces to win. And that's going to be taken into account by those young players when it's time to renegotiate their next contract.
Well, if you look at Caulfield and Suzuki's contracts, both take up 9.4% of the cap this season, right? Um, if Slavkovsky were to say, okay, well, I'm willing to take 9.4% of the cap when his contract expires is expected to be roughly $92 million, right? This is the number that Cap Friendly has for now as a placeholder, but it could even be higher than that. If it were to be $92 million, 9.4% would be at roughly an $8.65 million a year cap hit. So that would be Slavkovsky's version of a hometown discount, I guess, in the sense, or just falling in line with the salary structure that Suzuki's contract established. That would be that. Say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I'll sign an extension 7 times 8.65, same percentage of the cap as Nick, same percentage of the cap as Cole, but still making not quite about 800,000 more than either of them, a little less than that. So it's all relative, but like if this is why I think the Canadians should absolutely get into these talks right now. Like if they could get Slavkovsky, this is why if they could get Slavkovsky to sign a contract that comes in under Suzuki's contract, that'd be a big win, and it would
In
be,
terms of dollar or in terms of cap
in terms of
percentage?
dollar, in terms of
Okay.
dollar figure, and say, hey, would you be into an eight, and even if you want to go shorter term, let's say, because let's see, when his contract expires, Nick would have what, 4 years left on his, maybe 5. So maybe he can, maybe the trade off would be, we'll give you the 5-year term, which allows you to hit again the way Matthews did, but we ask you to come in at this number. And then when that 5 years is up, you get another big payday, assuming things go as well as we think they will, and as well as you think they will. That would be a big win. And honestly, it wouldn't be crazy for Slavkovsky to sign something like that. 5, 6 years at 7.85, same number as Caulfield, I guess,
Mhm.
and be ready to, he would be a year away from free agency, just like Matthews got it set up. He'd be a year away from unrestricted free agency at the end of that contract. So he would hold all the cards and would have all the leverage coming out of that contract. So that would be the trade off. And that would basically establish, the Canadiens' window to win
Yeah.
would basically be in line with that contract, because there's going to be obviously other contracts that have to come in. But yeah, it's the hometown discount thing. I think, it'll be interesting to see. Like we're talking about the free agent market this summer. Like Jonathan Marchessault's older, right? So
Yeah.
would he be willing to take like a 3-year deal with Montreal? And that would be his version of a hometown discount. Get paid handsomely for it, but short term. And
Hmm.
say, come here for 3 years, we'll give you whatever it is, $9 million. Um, and but we need a shorter term. Would he be willing to do that? Would he look from afar at, because it's clearly he's getting, it's pretty clear he's getting squeezed out in Vegas, right? Um, and so, they don't have the money to pay him. That's just a fact. And which, talk about culture, just as an aside,
Yeah.
you gotta love the Vegas Gold. Like the Vegas Golden Knights don't give a shit about culture.
No.
They don't care. They do not care about any of this stuff. Like they do all these things. They acquire Hannafin. They sign him to an extension. Like Jonathan Marchessault must be sitting there right before the playoffs start and be like, "Okay, I'm the Conn Smythe Trophy winner last year. I'm the only one who hasn't been taken care of. Clearly, they're not going to take care of me. And I'm going to go into these playoffs
Yeah.
with
Have I
this.
not done enough for you guys?
Have I not done enough? And so, he'll be what? He'll be 34 in December, right around Christmas. Would he be willing to take a short-term deal and to sign in Montreal and provide that scoring winger who's maybe not there when the Canadians reach ultimate contention, but helps them get there?
Yeah, maybe,
That's the
but
kind of hometown discount I would be looking at if I were the Canadians.
yeah, but it all depends if any guy you sign for 2, 3 years, does it make it more difficult to sign all your kids to long term contracts, especially on defense, that you will have to sign? It must not be a um, it must not be a deterrent into your salary structure to evolve, because if you sign a guy like Marchessault for 3 years, I doubt that during those 3 years you're going to be a Stanley Cup contender. So basically, you're just throwing a lot of money for a guy that's going to improve your team, but that's not necessarily going to make you a difference maker, or that's going to turn you into a Stanley Cup contender. So it's a lot of money for a guy that's only going to help you get better.
Well, unless you consider that getting better and being in the playoffs, playing playoff games will help your young players become Stanley Cup contenders. Like that's the calculation you have to make. You also have to realize that the Canadians have options with the Carey Price money, right? I mean, you just because they went into the season um, with him on the roster this year, which helped them greatly. Well, actually, you know what? This season didn't really make that big of a difference, to be honest, in the grand scheme of things, but did provide them with some flexibility going in season LTIR. But you always have the option of going off season LTIR with Carey Price, which is a lot more rigid,
Yeah.
makes it a lot more tricky, but is an option available to them if they feel it's worth it. So it depends, the extent to which they want to ensure that this team is playing competitive games, and not just competitive games the way the Capitals just play competitive games. Because, like, I don't. This is what I find so tricky. Like are the Capitals young guys, like, did Hendrix Lapierre really benefit from playing four? I don't even know if he played all four, but did he benefit from playing those playoff games, scoring that goal he scored um, last night?
Yeah,
It's Connor
for
McMichael,
sure
like
he did.
these young guys on that team have some benefit from those 4 games, but in the grand scheme of things, you got 2 home playoff dates. So from a business standpoint, that's obviously
Yeah,
that's money in the bank. But 2 dates, the Canadians have to make a decision. Like, are they gonna? Do they want that? Do they want to just get in and have that first taste so that guys can have a taste of it, and then you're that much hungrier to get it the year after? Or do you want to
hmm
wait and be patient and slowly build it to the point where you're entering the playoffs as a true, maybe not Stanley Cup contender, but as a tough out in the first round, let's say, like as a team that is going to compete and has a chance of winning their first round series. If it's the latter, then looking at things like Marchessault or whatever, like these short term fix that don't affect the long term plan, make some degree of sense.
yeah, but we know that they want to get better year after year, and they're going to take their time, but not that much. But to me, their eagerness to get better is going to be expressed, or will show itself by the amount of money that they would put on those free agents. If you
Okay.
if you put $8 million on the table for Marchessault, let alone 9, but let's say 8, it sends a message like we want to make a big jump now, and making that jump is important now. We don't want to wait one more year of development. And so that's where I think it's going to be interesting, because it's not just signing or not signing guys, it's the amount of money that you engage into those free agents that tells you how eager they
Yeah.
are to get better quickly.
Yeah. So anyhow, I mean, when you say like 8 or 9, like when I look at Marchessault and 30 goals, 28 goals, 42 goals last 3 seasons, 13 goals in 22 playoff games last season. He's already got 2 goals in 3 playoff games this season. So I mean, you're getting a gamer, right? I mean, I don't know. There's a price tag attached to that.
Incredible gamer.
Vegas,
Yeah,
yes, Vegas is clearly not going to pay it. He's a smaller guy, probably not the ideal person, but right shot, right wing. He checks a lot of boxes for them. Anyhow, I think this is a good place to transition into our mailbag because we have a question in the mailbag that is very relevant
sure.
to this exact topic. So let's go to the mailbag. We do a mailbag every Monday, you know.
Let's go to the mailbag. Let's go to the mailbag.
Mailbag.
You know, they reach out and they write to us.
Okay, so mailbag. We had a lot of questions on email. Thank you so much, everyone. But the one I want to get to first was sent in by Andrew McDougall, or
Okay.
McGregor. Sorry, my bad, Andrew McGregor. Um, it's a good. I think that we're gonna have a good discussion. I'm gonna read the whole thing. So Andrew writes, gentlemen, I'd like to know whether you feel, despite the Canadiens' bottom dweller status, they have already passed the point where even highly drafted players fit into their competitive window. The projections on draft picks are often based on when they will be on the team. But as we have seen from Gouli, Jackeye, and even Caulfield and Suzuki, that is a different time frame than when a drafted player is a key contributor to a lineup. That horizon for forwards looks to be about 5 years and can often be longer for defensemen and goaltenders. This is longer than the Canadiens have to maximize the current core of Suzuki, Caulfield, and Doc. Even if an exciting prospect like Lindstrom lands in the Canadiens' lap, doesn't this just mean he can pick up from a Suzuki or Caulfield when they begin to decline or enter free agency? And even if they are high on one of the many defensemen in the upcoming draft, won't that player just assist the Canadiens to maintain a middling defense in 5 to 7 years? If so, would it not be somewhat urgent as opposed to optional for the Canadiens to use this year's and next year's picks to acquire players in their early 20s, even if it means overpaying to acquire them? I'd appreciate your thoughts. Best regards, Andrew. The reason why I was laughing is because
Okay.
the Canadiens have not even entered their window yet, and we're already talking about when the window is going to close. It hasn't even opened. It's not even. It's not even open a crack. Like it's not. It's not. It's far. It's still far away. But I think Andrew's point is relevant, and our earlier discussion on the Leafs and every contending team in the league. You look at Tampa. Tampa, who's done like incredible work to keep that window open as long as they have. Uh, Somewhat undeniable that it's closing on them now, and you just there's a reality there that sets in, and Tampa's the exception, not the norm. Like most windows don't remain open as long as they manage to keep theirs open. So while I find it funny that Andrew's asking about the closing of the Canadiens window before it even opens, I think the reality in the NHL, unless you have some of these generational players that you've built teams around, that you can move interchangeable parts around them. But if you
Yeah.
purely build like a team in the purest sense of the word, those windows generally don't last very long. So it is somewhat vital for the Canadiens to like properly ascertain when that window is going to open and when it's going to close, and make sure that they have the best chance they've got at winning in those years. And so I would say, and I'll kick it over to you, but I would say, Andrew, that I don't agree that the Canadiens should be trading their top pick this year for a player in his 20s. I mean, the easy guy to mention, obviously from the last episode, you can look at all the guys that we talked about. All the guys that we talked about, except for Patrick Laine, basically, are all in their early 20s. So, would you be okay with trading that pick for a Marty Necas or for a Trevor Zegras or a package around them? Like it's. I think the Canadiens still have another year where they can add to their prospect pool, but I agree with you that as of next year, they have to start using their draft capital as trade ammunition more than more than draft ammunition, including their own first round pick. Like if their pick falls in the 14 to 18 range next year, that pick's got to be in play to go add, to go add more short-term talent while you wait for these drafted kids to develop.
Yeah. Well, when Andrew talks about the time frame to develop a prospect, even at forward, it's interesting to see that it's the exception now to have an 18 or even a 19-year-old have a real offensive impact when he first enters the league.
Mhm.
Let's say if we scale back to a few years, okay, let's say 2020, the draft of 2020 has provided us this season with 6 players who hit the 50-point mark. Those are Lucas Raymond, Tim Stutzle, Seth Jarvis, Alexis Lafreniere, Quentin Byfield, and JJ Peterka.
Mhm.
Surprisingly, the draft before 2019, the draft that everybody thought that it'd be like the best thing ever.
Mhm.
This year, 4 guys hit the 50-point mark: Jack Hughes, Matt Boldy, Cole Caulfield, and Matthias Michelli. So if we just, I think that eventually things will get in place, and the 2019 draft should provide a majority of impact player. But if we just look at 2020 and say we've have we've had 6 guys hitting the 50-point mark,
Mhm.
it suggests that it takes 4 years. Those guys are 21 years old now, so it's 4 years after their draft that they've 4 seasons after their draft that they've become, all of them, impactful player. And if we go later, the 2021 draft, only one guy hit the 50-point mark, and that's Wyatt Johnson.
Mhm.
2022, one guy, Slav.
Yeah.
So let's say it takes 4 years. Um, that means that the guy that they would draft this year, let's say a Lindstrom, to become an impact player, and I used the 50-point mark, but it could be, you could put the measurement somewhere else, but let's say it's 50-point.
Mhm.
Um, 4 years from now, Suzuki would still have 3 years left on his deal.
Right.
Caulfield would still have 4 years left on his deal. So it's not true that the window would be about to close. Suzuki
Mhm.
would still be a guy that's in his 20s. Slavkovsky would still be a young player. That blue line would still be very young or up and coming. So it's not too late to draft a forward and hope that this guy is going to be an impactful member of the Canadians, even though he might not hit the first year or two. It'll
Mhm.
take some time. That's how hockey has evolved nowadays. Even Jack Hughes, his first year or two was not great. Um, but in 4 years' time, that nucleus would likely be the same. So
Mhm.
I agree with you. Maybe that their calculations might be different next year depending on where they draft. I personally would not be opposed to trading that number 5 or 6 draft pick this year, but it would be for an even better player than the Zegras and Netches that could be had some other ways.
Right.
But in all likelihood, whether the Canadians find themselves with a Lindstrom, um, a an Engenler, or by any miracle a Demidov, those guys will their success would fit with the current group. So it's
Mhm.
certainly not too late.
No. And what's interesting is so Suzuki's draft year, which is 2017. It's only 11 guys from that draft year who got 50 points this year, and well, no, two of them are defensemen. So
Huh.
you have 9 guys, no, 9 forwards from that draft year: Elias Pettersson, Robert Thomas rather, Jason Robertson, Suzuki, Nico Hischier, Drake Batherson, Casey Middlestat, Owen Tippett, Marty Necas are the guys who made 50 points, and Middlestat to me is the real intriguing one because really he did not hit until this year, um,
No.
and I think Batherson to some extent, like the extent to which he produced this year was kind of unforeseen this is really for a lot of the guys on this list. Thomas getting to 86 points, this is like, this is really the prime. And so
Mm-hmm.
2017, so that's 7 years from draft day, 6 years really from the start of the season. So 6 years from draft day to now to be like a prime. And so yes, maybe by then Suzuki's contract will have run out or Caulfield's contract will have run out, but you're still getting some of the good years of that forward while they're still around. And just because their contracts run out doesn't mean it's over for the Canadians. You know what I mean? It's like yes, that they're the Suzuki and Caulfield contracts to some extent um, create a window for the Canadians that they need to build a competitive team around these two contracts essentially by the end of them. Um, I think that's reasonable, but I think adding a high end forward off this draft is would not only it's necessary. I actually don't think there's any way around it. Like they should be drafting, they should be picking up a high end forward with their first round pick this year, and then what they do with the other picks doesn't really matter. They can trade them away, they can draft players, whatever. But that top pick, I think, needs to be used to get another top talent into the organization.
Speaking of the draft, here's a question from Bill Lawler. He says,
Mm.
"Hey guys, if the Canadians end up picking fifth or sixth, which is by far the most likely scenario at almost 70%, do you see a chance that they move down in the draft and in the process still getting a forward they still like a lot, as well as a legit top six guy for that fifth pick? For ease of illustration, Calgary, ninth draft slot as of now, and Philly, 12th draft slot as of now, both also have first round picks, and the relative draft value of moving from 5th to 12th is a late first round pick. The relative draft value from moving from 5th to 9th is an early second. I guess you could include Ottawa in the conversation. Habs move from 5th to 7th. Okay, so can you still get a forward you like at number 9 or number 12? The Ginlas, the Lindstroms, the Kattens, the Eisermans, and turn the number 5 pick into a Netches Zegras type player per your Friday episode. I don't think it works that way. If the Canadians were to trade down, it's because the team that wants to move that, let's say their number 9 pick, they're coveting the number 5 pick.
Mm-hmm.
And the Canadians would be getting an extra asset in order to trade down.
Yeah.
And so I think that, and usually when you move up or you move down, the currency is more often a draft pick than a roster player. So if the Canadians were to go from 5 to 9, the extra asset that they would receive would probably be a draft pick. And I doubt the Canadians are in the market to add even more draft picks than what they already got. They could move up, though. They could choose to say, well, we're going to use our first round pick from Winnipeg and go from 5 to 3 maybe, or even 5 to 4, who knows, and put that in the balance. But trading down, unless it's for the type of roster player that would make them better, it might not be an impact player, but it would be probably a specialty player that they think they got a need for. Like a physical third line player who just that they don't have a lot of in their system. Maybe, I don't know. But there's usually it would be a draft pick. So that's why I think that if they choose to move, and they might because Kent Hughes opened the door to that possibility when he was asked about what do you do if basically your main targets on at the forwards position are taken where you're going to draft and you're just surrounded with a slew of defense prospects. What are you going to do? So he said, well, maybe we could we could look at moving up or down. But I think that it seems to me more likely that they would move up than down.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Bill. I just want to point out that Bill is also from Newfoundland.
Oh,
Yeah, he is from.
that's great.
He's actually not only from Newfoundland, he's also from Portugal Cove, Newfoundland. So Bill asked if it helps get my question on the podcast. I am also from Portugal Cove, Newfoundland. It worked. Bill, adding your hometown worked. And we love that we are so popular in Portugal Cove, Newfoundland. So thank you for listening from Portugal Cove, Newfoundland. Okay, so we have a question from Brian. Brian asks, Brian's searching for the next Adam Fox, and not necessarily a defenseman like him, but an impactful drafted NCAA player who leverages the CBA to force a trade to a team of their choosing, in this case, Montreal. It says, given Hughes, Gordon, and especially St. Louis' reputation across college hockey, it seems plausible that Montreal could be a preferred destination for NCAA prospects. Montreal can also offer a spot in the top 9 as early as this season. That is not a given for many teams with NCAA prospects. So here are a couple of the candidates about that he's thinking. And before I read these, let me just say, Brian, first off, players with the resolve that Adam Fox had to get himself to New York are pretty rare. Most players are just trying to make the NHL. It's exceedingly rare that you see a player as talented. And Adam Fox wasn't even a first round pick, if I'm not mistaken. He was picked in the second round. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, third round. Sorry, he's a third round pick and had enough confidence in himself to engineer that trade. Two trades from Calgary to Carolina. Wouldn't sign with Carolina, then Carolina to New York. That's rare. And most of the time when players do this, like Cutter Gauthier, I guess you could say did it, but those were very unique circumstances. So Brian mentions a couple of names. First one being Rutger McGroarty in Winnipeg, and the next one being Gabe Perreault in New York. And I think the reasoning behind it is pretty sound, that in both Winnipeg's case and New York's case, it's going to be difficult for them to make room for these players. And I think the reason McGroarty decided to go back to college is that Winnipeg couldn't guarantee him a spot in the NHL next season. And he said, well, if I'm going to play in the AHL, I might as well just go back to Michigan and try to win a national championship. So I don't think, Brian, to be honest with you, in either case, that either player is going to, if they chose to go that route, that I'm going to force my team to trade me somewhere. I don't think either of those players would necessarily choose Montreal, first of all.
No, that's it. That's it.
And even if they did, I don't think they're going to do what Adam Fox what Adam Fox ultimately did. Like most players who are in Adam Fox's position, they would have just signed with Carolina. After Calgary tried to sign you, you say, I'm not signing with you. They traded to Carolina. Most 99% of guys in that situation would have just signed with Carolina and said, okay, this is good enough. And maybe let's try and make this work. It's not as if Carolina was a bad team. So yeah. So to answer your question, I don't think either of those situations would fit. The Canadiens would love to get their hands on Rutger McGroarty. I know that they were quite fond of him in his draft year, which was last year, obviously. They liked him a lot. Obviously, they didn't have a pick that really worked to get him, but it's not likely that the Canadiens can benefit from this in any way, because Adam Fox is one of one in the way he handled his introduction to professional hockey. You don't see that too often at all.
And we're talking about American prospects too, and I don't think that the Montreal Canadiens draw enough attention, and they're not a magnet for American players at this time. And I think that if you decide to conduct your career that way, There's also a grid of analysis as to what do you want
Hmm.
out of your career and where are you going to play, but also potentially how much money you're going to make. If you decide to go that route, it's more likely that teams will go either to New York. Players would go either to New York, or they would look at teams where it's favorable from a tax point of view. That's where Florida, Tampa, Nashville, Dallas become so attractive. So
Yeah.
teams like Montreal are actually at a disadvantage, and the fact that their management and their head coach might be viewed positively, yeah, it's probably something that's interesting. It could be eventually a card that they can play, but we're nowhere near. I think the fact that it could be impactful to the extent that you could lure like American prospects playing in the NCAA whose rights belong to another team.
Mhm.
It's we're far from that still.
Yeah.
There's Fabian. Fabian is asking us, with the assistant coaches needing to be re-signed and with the relatively unknown status of Vincent Lecavalier with the Habs, do you think it's possible that he gets brought in to replace one of the assistants?
Mhm.
No, I
Yeah.
don't think so.
That's a hard
uh,
no.
no, Vincent is living in Florida. I think that he's happy to help out and be involved with the Canadians. He's doing a lot of scouting, both professionally and at the amateur level. He's being he's an advisor in the sense that they'll send tapes to him and say, "What do you think about this player?" And he's happy to provide his take on that player, whether he's a veteran or he's a you know a draft prospect. But as to get into the grind of working every day, follow the team on an everyday basis, I don't even think that this is something that he wants.
No.
He likes the situation that he's got there in Florida. If I'm not mistaken, he's got rather young kids too. You're right, Fabian, that most of the assistant coaches will need new contracts this summer. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think that it's all of them except for Stefan Robida. But if there is any change, and I'm not even sure that they're going to make a single change to their assistant coaches group. But if they were, I don't see Le Cavalier being an option at all.
No. And frankly, if they were to make a change to their assistant coaches group, it would be to bring in an experienced voice behind the bench. I think it would be someone who has some coaching chops to him, which obviously Vincent Cavalier does not have. And Ken Hughes was asked directly about this, the desire to add experience. He said at this time, we don't see a need to do that. But I do think if they changed anything behind the bench or in the coaching group, that would be the reason to do it. And
Mhm.
Vincent Cavalier does not obviously fit that.
But that wouldn't even be for necessarily with NHL experience. You talk about coaching experience. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just speculating here, but if they were looking at somebody from bringing somebody from the outside, I could see Martin Saint Louis looking at one of the people that he's gotten to know through his networking with Team USA, people that philosophically think the way that he does,
Yeah.
and people that have been coaching at different levels, not necessarily in the NHL, but that have developed an experience and an expertise that way. So you could argue that Adam Nicholas didn't have a ton of NHL experience. He had been working for the Maple Leafs for a year or two before he got hired by the Canadians. But in the role that he occupies with Montreal, he had a lot of prior experience at other levels. So if the Canadians were to make a change, that which would be motivated by Martin Saint Louis, this is an avenue I think that we cannot discard.
No, I agree with that, but I do think if they were to make a change that was not triggered by Martin St. Louis, that was triggered by management, that
Mm-hmm.
would be, I think, the just a veteran game manager, and whether that's at the NHL level, at the college level, I mean, honestly, someone just who has experience managing a bench and managing game situations.
Yeah, yeah.
I know that these are discussions that have happened at the management level, and but they're not going to impose anyone on Martin St. Louis. Like that's Martin has to be on board with whatever they decide. And he
Hmm.
himself has built a lot of trust with the guys that he has. They work very well together. But sometimes, in order for improvements to be made, they need to be imposed. So, but anyhow, all that to say, I agree that I don't think it's going to be Vincent LeCavalier doing it. Um,
No.
Quick one from Bob in Chicago who asks, how come we don't hear about Anthony Duclair as an option in the top six for the Habs free agent search? And why hasn't he stuck around long term with any team? Checks a lot of boxes, relatively young, winger, lots of speed, would probably get signed for a reasonable contract. Um, why he bounced around from lots of teams is that, I don't know if you remember, Bob, John Tortorella's diatribe when he came to Montreal with the Columbus Blue Jackets and Anthony Duclair was playing on his team. This was like just an extreme example of what's been an issue with Anthony Duclair for a while. I think as he's matured as a player, and sorry, just to summarize that, John Tortorella basically told the entire Montreal media, knowing full well Anthony Duclair was in his hometown, that he's not sure if Anthony Duclair knows how to play the game. It was just a honestly a pretty classless kind of move. I really didn't appreciate him coming into Montreal and saying that. Say that in Columbus or whatever, but like he really went out of his way to
Yeah.
just hammer this kid really hard. Um, but that kind of crystallized why he's bounced around. Like he's not been adaptable early in his career. Wasn't very adaptable to the various systems and what have you, and just sort of relied on his speed and his he's a pretty skilled player too. But I think as he's matured, look, listen, he's been a great fit in Tampa. He's fitted really well, and that's not an easy team to fit in on. There's a certain way that they go about doing things. You fall in line. Martin St. Louis always talks about teams like Tampa and Boston where you can change parts and people come in and they fall in line and they just jump on the train and it keeps going. Well, that's what Duclair did in Tampa and turned into actually a really impactful deadline acquisition for them. So yeah, I mean, it's again, if you're looking at a short-term fix as a free agent, I can maybe see that, and I doubt it's something. I doubt it's someone the Canadians would pursue with great enthusiasm necessarily,
Yeah.
but if they felt that their team needed an infusion of speed and skill and some offense, and they struck out elsewhere, bringing a hometown kid home, a guy who fit in Tampa, that would probably resonate with Marty and his ability to kind of fit in with whatever he's trying to do. Maybe, but I think Anthony Duclair is just going to, unfortunately for him, be kind of a fringe guy as a free agent, probably for I don't want to say probably for the rest of his career, but he is who he is in a way.
Is he like in that very small category of the Daniel Sprong players, like offensive bottom six guys?
Yeah, somewhat. No, I don't think he's in the same. Like he's kind of, I would say, like Daniel Sprong is kind of in a league of his own in that sense, but it's yeah, he's not. I think he can, and listen, he had good years in Florida as well. It's just for whatever reason hasn't been able to stick around anywhere for a long time. And the fact is that if he were to sign in Montreal, he wouldn't be sticking around in Montreal for a long time either. Like I can't see him getting more than a 2 or 3 year
No.
contract. So if that were to even happen, so I don't know, but it's a good point because he's looked really good in Tampa, and to me, if you
Yeah,
could
but
fit in on Tampa,
they knew what they were getting though because it was his second go there, so they
yeah,
know about his warts. They know how he could fit on their team, and they knew also that it was a quick fix as a guy who was on an expiring contract. So,
mhm,
uh, and they didn't need to pay much to get him either. So, I think that it was a smart acquisition. But when you've handled the guy before, and you know what what impacts he has on your group, then the
mhm.
second time around, it's easier to bring him back and say, okay, Now I know full well how this is going to turn out, and this is what I'm willing to pay for in order to acquire that something that he's going to bring us. So it's
Hmm.
good.
Okay.
Okay, quick one here. Sean Long. We could split that in two. This is Sean, originally from Montreal, now living in Miami. Well, look at you now. Looking back over the last few years, what single trade and what single draft would you most like a redo on that you feel would affect the current team the most? I think for the draft, it's a super easy answer, but you go from KK to
Yeah.
Brady Kachuk, and I mean the situation is very, very different because Brady Kachuk would be on my top 5 list of players I would like the Canadians to acquire the most. He's something of what they need greatly, and I mean the dynamics on this team would be very different had the Canadians chosen to go past the fact that he had not scored a ton of goals in his first NCAA year, or the fact that he was not a speedster, but he's a Kachuk, and being a
Uh-huh.
Kachuk in itself has its own merits and its own use, and he's been a very, very impactful player. So to me, it's an easy answer on the draft side. How about you for the trade, man?
The trade. Well, I mean, there are a few. Like Sean suggested, the Drouin Sergachev trade, which I think is very. It's hard to beat that one because
Yeah.
this team with Mikhail Sergachev on it right now uh, would would look significantly would look significantly better. Like it's significantly different. Obviously, if you have Sergachev, do you trade for Matheson? Do you do this? Do you do that? There's all sorts of things, all sorts of permutations that kind of come off of that. But if you were to add Sergachev to this current group on defense, it would look really good. Like you have a top four down the road of Sergachev, Hudson on the left, and Reinbacher, Mayu on the right, with Sergachev as kind of the veteran leader of that group. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
That looks pretty good. So, yeah, because honestly, like trade wise, I mean, I think you watch Arturi Lehkonen play in the playoffs,
Yeah.
and I hate doing this because Lehkonen on the Canadians would not be the same player as he is for the Avalanche. Lehkonen is a player that needed to be on a good team. Obviously, hindsight is 2020, but that's probably the only miss this administration has had so far as a trade. Um, Barron is, Barron might still pan out. He's still very young. But Arturi Lehkonen is the type of player that a team hoping to make the playoffs, like the Canadians are right now, um, would like to have.
Yeah.
But it's again, I'm not. I would still stick with Sergachev, Drouin, because Barron has not been given the appropriate amount of time to pan out or not. I think there's still signs that he could be a good NHL defenseman. And I don't know, people forget how they talked about Arturi Lehkonen when he was in Montreal, and he couldn't put the puck in an empty net. How many chances did this guy miss? Why doesn't he ever score any goals? This, that, and the other. Like he was criticized pretty consistently from a lot of angles, media, fans. There was not a great appreciation among a portion of the fan base, I would say, of what Arturi Lehkonen brought the Canadians. And that was the problem with him staying in Montreal, is that he brings those things to winning teams. He
Yeah.
brings those things when he's surrounded by players that he can complement and augment their skills. So I'll stick with the Sergachev deal, but Lekkonen's in the running. Let's say that.
The one caveat with Sergachev though is that it's easy to say, looking at what he became with Tampa, say, yeah, I'd love to have that guy on my team now. But I wonder what would have been his development had he stayed in Montreal, because he was in line to be like the number one left defenseman, probably the guy who would have been paired with Shea Weber,
Hmm.
and he would have been probably thrown in the wolves and be given minutes right from the get-go that he was not ready for. And with Tampa, they took their time and they really brought him slowly, and he became, how many years did he spend as, having the minutes of a third pairing guy? Certainly his first 3 seasons there.
Hmm.
So they took their time and it paid off because he's a much more well-rounded defenseman now. But probably that his development trajectory, had he stayed with Montreal, would not have been the same as with Tampa. That being said,
He had 40 points as a rookie.
Yeah, yeah,
It's pretty impressive.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. But he was
sheltered
all
for
offensive.
sure. He was sheltered. Yeah, absolutely. He was definitely sheltered.
But I'm not trying to defend that trade, because for sure that's a given. It's just a little caveat, because I'm not sure if the Canadians were equipped to develop him the way that Tampa did. But for sure, I would have rather have him in Montreal than Drouin, because the Canadians had. I've made that point very often. They had two holes, left side defense and center, and they traded the solution to one of their two holes for a guy who was not the solution to the other hole.
Yeah.
So,
but I think, other than the fact that Canadians were awful, like that, Sergachev's rookie season in Tampa was 2017-18, which is obviously the year that resulted in the Canadians having the third overall pick. So that was a difficult season. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if he would, because there are worse ways to develop than playing as a D partner for Shea Weber. Like
for sure.
But
it would have been more trial by fire.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. But he did Okay. Well, I think we're gonna leave it at that for now. Congratulations, Marc Antoine. Marc Antoine has pneumonia, and he got through this entire episode. He made it. But yeah, so we'll be back next Monday. So every episode from now until the draft, or until, for the next month or so, I guess, is going to be just, geared looking like this. There'll be mailbag episodes every episode. So keep sending in basuandgodet@gmail.com or Basu and Godet on X. Other than that, have a good week. Enjoy the playoff hockey. I know I am. And we will talk to you next Monday right here.